Darling, what's wrong?
It can't be. Sarah? Is there a problem here?
Let's go, Julian. It's nothing.
Orchestrated dramatic narrative structure adhering to detailed stylistic specifications. Damien Cross dropped his champagne glass the moment he saw her walk through the door. Not because she was beautiful, she had always been beautiful, though he had spent 3 years telling himself otherwise. Not because she was pregnant, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. What made the blood drain from his face, what made his jaw go slack in front of every powerful person in Manhattan, was the man beside her. Nathan Ashford, the shipping tycoon whose handshake could make or break entire industries, had his arm around the woman Damien had thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. If you want to see how a man who thought he owned the world discovers he never even owned himself, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to where it all started. 3 years before that moment at the restaurant, Damien Cross sat on top of the world and believed he deserved every inch of it. Cross Industries occupied 42 floors of a glass tower on Park Avenue, and from his corner office on the top floor, Damien could look down on most of Manhattan. He liked that. He liked looking down. At 53, he had the kind of face that belonged on the cover of a business magazine, sharp, tanned, carefully maintained. His hair was silver at the temples, which his stylist assured him made him look distinguished. His suits were custom-made in Milan. Claude's response was interrupted. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of Aurelius, and for a few seconds the ambient noise of the restaurant, the clink of crystal, the low murmur of 100 carefully modulated conversations seemed to hold its breath. Damien hadn't moved from his spot near the bar. His girlfriend, Tara, had been talking for the past several minutes, her hand resting on his forearm, her words sailing completely past him. He heard none of it. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn and Nathan as they followed the maitre d' toward a table near the center of the room. Not a corner table, not a table by the window where you could be easily overlooked. The center, where everyone could see them, where everyone could see her. Evelyn looked different. That was the first thing Damien couldn't stop processing, not different in a way he could dismiss or explain away. She had always been attractive, quietly so, the kind of woman whose appearance crept up on you slowly rather than announcing itself. But the woman crossing the restaurant floor right now wasn't quiet about anything. She wore a deep navy dress that acknowledged her pregnancy rather than apologizing for it. Her dark hair swept off her neck, and she was laughing at something Nathan had leaned down to say close to her ear. It was a real laugh. Not the careful, measured kind she used to produce at his business dinners when she wasn't sure whether smiling was appropriate. Damien remembered that version of her laugh. He hadn't thought about it in years. "Damien," Tara's voice sharpened. "Did you hear what I just said?" "I heard you," he said, though he hadn't. Tara followed his line of sight across the room, and her expression shifted into something careful and evaluating. At 29, she had learned to read the geography of Damien's attention quickly. "Is that your ex-wife?" "Yes." "She's pregnant." "I can see that." "Who's she with?" Damien picked up his champagne glass and found it empty. He set it back down. "Nathan Ashford." Tara went quiet. Even she knew that name. Nathan Ashford was 61 years old and built like a man who had worked on the docks before he owned them. He was taller than Damien by 3 inches and carried himself without any of the careful performance Damien relied on. No studied posture, no calculated expression. He simply walked into rooms as though he had been there before and expected to be comfortable, and that ease, that complete absence of effort, was somehow more commanding than anything Damien had ever managed in his life. The maitre d' pulled out Evelyn's chair, and Nathan touched her elbow briefly as she sat. Just a light touch, automatic, the kind of gesture a person makes when it has become second nature. Evelyn looked up and said something to him, and he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Damien feel as though he was watching something private he had no business witnessing. He watched until the feeling became intolerable, and then he kept watching anyway. "Let's go say hello," he said. Tara's hand tightened on his arm. "Damien, maybe we shouldn't—" "I'm not going to make a scene." He straightened his jacket. "She's my ex-wife. It would be strange not to." That was a lie, and they both knew it. Strange was precisely what he wanted. He wanted to walk over there and recalibrate whatever was happening in that corner of the room, wanted to reinsert himself into Evelyn's field of vision and remind both of them, of the proper order of things. He had moved on. He was with someone younger, someone vibrant. He had done well. That was the story, and somewhere in the past few minutes, the story had gotten away from him. He crossed the restaurant floor with Tara trailing just behind. Nathan saw him coming first. He didn't tense or adjust his posture. He simply noted Damien's approach the way a man might note a minor change in weather, something that required awareness but not alarm, and then he said something quietly to Evelyn. She turned. For a half-second, something passed across Evelyn's face. It was gone quickly, replaced by an expression Damien couldn't entirely categorize. Not warmth, not hostility, something more neutral than either, the way a person looks at a place they used to live and no longer do. "Damien," she said. "Evelyn." He stopped at their table, hands easy at his sides, manufacturing a relaxed smile. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "It's a reservation," she said simply. Up close, she looked even better than she had from across the room, which was not the outcome he had been hoping for. There were shadows under her eyes. She wasn't sleeping perfectly, the pregnancy showing in that way too. But her skin had that particular quality that some women got in their second trimester, something luminous and infuriating. And her eyes were steady in a way they hadn't always been when she looked at him. She didn't look away. He turned to Nathan and extended his hand, because not doing so would have been an admission of something. "Damien Cross, I don't think we've been formally introduced." Nathan shook his hand. His grip was firm without being a demonstration. "Nathan Ashford, I know who you are." That sentence should have been a compliment. In Damien's experience, it usually was. But the way Nathan said it was perfectly uninflected, neither warm nor cold, and somehow that was worse than either. "I wanted to congratulate you both," Damien said, nodding toward Evelyn's visible pregnancy. "When are you expecting?" "April," Evelyn said. "That's wonderful." He said it the way people say things they don't believe. "You look well." "I am well." A pause stretched between them. Tara hovered at Damien's side, and he was suddenly very aware of her presence, her youth, her careful beauty, the way she had been deployed tonight as evidence of something. It seemed less convincing than it had an hour ago. "Well," Damien said, "we won't interrupt your evening." "Actually," a voice said from behind him, and Damien turned to find Jeffrey Hale standing 3 feet away. Jeffrey was a senior partner at one of the city's largest investment banks, a man whose opinion moved money. He was looking past Damien entirely. "Nathan, I thought that was you. And Evelyn, you look absolutely radiant." He stepped around Damien as though he weren't there. Within 4 minutes, a small and effortless gravitational pull had formed around Evelyn and Nathan's table. Jeffrey and his wife, a federal judge whose name appeared in newspapers regularly. A woman who ran one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the country. They gathered the way people gather around something real, pulled by some social instinct Damien had always believed he possessed, and was now watching operate entirely without him. He stood at the edge of it, and Tara stood beside him, and nobody turned to include either of them. Damien had been in that restaurant many times. He knew most of these people, had done business with several of them, had attended their events, had sat on the same committees. But in this particular moment, in this particular arrangement, he was furniture. He said something to Tara about returning to their table. She agreed with visible relief. He did not look back across the room for the rest of the meal. He didn't need to. He could feel the warmth of it from 60 feet away, the easy laughter, the sound of a table where people were genuinely glad to be. He ate his food. He tasted none of it. The night air outside Aurelius hit him at 10:45, colder than expected for the season, and Damien stood on the sidewalk while the valet retrieved his car. Tara was checking her phone beside him, giving him the space that had become standard between them when he went somewhere she couldn't follow. He had almost gotten his breathing back to normal when the restaurant doors opened behind him, and he heard Evelyn's voice. She and Nathan were saying goodnight to someone just inside the entrance, some warmth being exchanged, and then the doors swung open and they stepped outside. Damien should have been in his car by then. He wasn't. "Damien," Evelyn's voice was even. Heading out? He heard himself say it and recognized the words as pointless. We are, yes. Nathan was standing beside her, one hand resting at the small of her back, his attention moving with calm efficiency across the sidewalk, the way men do when they are quietly making sure the people they care about are comfortable and safe. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't performative. It was just present. Something inside Damien's chest had been compressed all evening, and now it pushed against its own walls. You seem happy, he said to Evelyn. He hadn't intended to say it with any particular weight, but it came out carrying more than he meant. She looked at him for a moment. I am, she said. Just that. Good. He nodded. His car arrived. The valet held the door, he got in, and Tara got in beside him, and the door closed, and through the tinted window he watched Nathan take Evelyn's hand as they walked toward their own car. Not dramatically, not as any kind of gesture directed at him, just two people walking together who happened to hold hands, and Damien Cross sat in $40,000 worth of German engineering and felt, for the first time in many years, something close to afraid. He said nothing on the drive home. That was the last peaceful night he would have for a very long time. The next morning started the way most of his mornings did, precisely, efficiently, with the structure of routines that had been designed to make him feel in control. He was at his desk by 7:15, coffee untouched, working through overnight reports. His executive assistant, Marcus, appeared at 8 with the first round of briefings, pending contracts, board correspondence, a quarterly review needing his signature. At 8:47, Marcus appeared again. His face was doing something careful. There's a message from Ashford Meridian, Marcus said. From Nathan Ashford's office directly. Damien looked up. What does it say? They're terminating the partnership agreement. Damien's pen stopped moving. Which partnership agreement? The Harbor Line distribution deal. Marcus set the letter on the desk. Effective 30 days from today. They're citing contractual flexibility provisions in Section 12. No specific cause stated. Damien picked up the letter. It was a single page. The language was clean and legal and final. There was no room in it for misunderstanding. The Harbor Line distribution partnership had been in the works for 14 months. It represented $1.2 billion in projected revenue over 5 years, revenue that Cross Industries had already factored into its forward projections, revenue that certain investors had been shown in private briefings, revenue that underpinned significant portions of the company's current market valuation. It was the kind of deal that didn't just bring money in. It told a story about where the company was going. It was the architecture of confidence. Without it, the architecture became a question. Damien read the letter twice. Then he set it down and picked up his phone to call his chief financial officer, a careful woman named Patricia Ricci, who had been managing the company's finances for 11 years and who had a particular stillness about her that only cracked under genuine pressure. She picked up on the first ring. I was about to call you, she said. You've seen the Ashford letter. I've seen the Ashford letter and I've seen the market this morning, and I think you need to come down to my floor before the 9 o'clock opens. How bad? A pause. Come down, Damien? He went down. The trading floor indicators were already moving before the market officially opened. Pre-market activity, institutional positioning, the subtle seismic shifts that happened when large amounts of money began to change their minds. Patricia walked him through it at a conference table, her voice measured, her data immaculate, and what she described was not a stumble. It was a cascade. The Harbor Line termination had leaked, or had been allowed to leak, which was a different thing. And the first wave of response was institutional investors recalculating their exposure. 3 hedge funds that held significant cross-industries positions had already begun trimming. The stock would open down 7 to 10%, possibly more depending on how the first hour traded. This is one partnership, Damien said, one deal terminating. We have other revenue streams. Yes, Patricia said, but this one was the growth story. The others are maintenance. She folded her hands on the table. When you strip the growth story out, certain questions about the existing revenue streams become harder to ignore. What questions? She was quiet for a moment longer than he liked. The kind of questions we should probably talk about with legal present. That sentence lived in the air between them. Damien heard it clearly. He had heard its shape before in other contexts and had always managed to redirect around it. Right now, redirecting did not seem immediately available. The market opened at 9:30. Cross Industries dropped 11% in the first 20 minutes. By noon, it was down 16. Several institutional investors who had been privately briefed on those forward projections, the ones that had included the Harborline revenue, were now in their own conversations with their own lawyers, doing their own arithmetic about what they had been told and when. Damien spent the morning in calls he had not expected to be making. His tone was controlled. His explanations were measured. He was a man who had navigated crises before, who understood that panic was a multiplier, that projecting stability was itself a form of stability. But by early afternoon, 3 board members had requested an emergency session for the following week, and the requests had a particular formality to them that Damien recognized. He had seen that formality used on other executives. He had never thought about what it felt like to be on the other side of it. He called his personal attorney, a man named Stuart Freed, who had handled Damien's legal affairs for 15 years and who charged rates that made other lawyers uncomfortable. "I need to know where we stand," Damien said. "I know," Stuart said. "I've been going through your files since 6 this morning. There are some exposure points that concern me." Such as the forward projections shared with institutional investors in the second and fourth quarters of last year. Specifically, whether the Harborline revenue was presented as confirmed rather than projected. It was a reasonable projection. That depends on whether certain representations were made about the state of the negotiations at the time of those briefings. Stuart's voice was careful and professional and entirely without comfort. "There are some emails I'd like to walk you through." Damien went home that evening before 7, which he almost never did. Tara was there. She had been waiting, and her expression when he came through the door told him she had been following the news. "How bad is it?" she asked. "It's manageable," he said, because that was the only sentence he knew how to say. She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Tara was many things, but she was not unintelligent, and she had spent 3 years in the orbit of wealth and power long enough to understand the difference between a manageable problem and a man telling himself a story. That night, lying awake at 2 in the morning with the city humming 30 stories below, Damien's mind kept returning not to the financial cascade or the board requests or Stuart's careful voice on the phone. It kept returning to a table in the center of a restaurant, and a woman laughing at something her husband said, and a group of people pulling toward that table like it was somewhere warm. He had built his entire life on the architecture of being someone that other people wanted to be near. And in one evening, in one restaurant, with almost no effort at all, Evelyn had simply outweighed him, without trying to, without even seeming to notice. He didn't sleep. By the end of the week, the board had moved their emergency session up by 2 days, and Damien sat at the head of a conference table he had occupied for 14 years and watched faces he had known for decades perform the mathematics of institutional survival. They were not unkind about it. Boards rarely were, when they moved carefully enough. But the motion that came at the end of that meeting, a temporary transfer of executive authority pending review of financial practices, was wrapped in the language of prudence, and it meant exactly what it sounded like. Damien Cross walked out of the boardroom on a Thursday afternoon, and his badge still worked, and his office was still his, but the thing he had been for 14 years was already in the process of becoming past tense. His communications team drafted a statement. The press release called it a voluntary transition to facilitate regulatory cooperation. Most of the journalists who covered the company printed it without comment, which was almost worse than if they had pushed back. When reporters don't push back, it's because they already know the real story and are simply waiting for it to finish writing itself. But Damien wasn't done yet. He was many things, and among them was a man who did not recognize walls as permanent. He had always found a way through or around or over. That was the story he told himself about himself, the central narrative of his entire identity, that he was the kind of man who found ways. So on a Friday afternoon, 9 days after the Aurelius restaurant, 11 days after losing operational control of his company, 4 days after his attorneys had been in a formal dialogue with federal regulators, Damien Cross made the worst decision of his life. He filed a legal claim against Evelyn and Nathan Ashford. The filing was his attorney Stuart's first genuine moment of resistance in 15 years of representing him. "Damien, I can't recommend this," Stuart had said, his voice stripped of its usual professional diplomacy. "I can put the paperwork together, I can file it. But I want you to hear me clearly. This is not a move. This is a reaction. There's no legal basis strong enough to survive scrutiny, and you're going to draw attention to yourself at a time when you cannot afford to draw attention. File it, Damien said. What is your actual theory of the case here? What Damien said next was something he had been telling himself privately for 9 days, something that had grown in the darkness of 2 in the morning logic into a shape that almost made sense. The child, he said. She was still my wife 14 months ago. I want paternity established. Stuart was quiet for a long time. 14 months ago, you had already been divorced for 2 years. I want it on record. Damien, file it, Stuart. The filing went public within 48 hours. These things always did. And the reaction was not the leverage Damien had imagined, not the negotiating position, not the reminder to the world that Evelyn Hart had once been Evelyn Cross, and was therefore still somehow within his orbit of relevance. Instead, it landed the way a man landing badly after jumping from somewhere too high lands, with a sound that made people nearby wince and look away. The legal press covered it in 2 paragraphs. The financial press covered it in 8. The implication in those 8 paragraphs was not subtle. Here was a man who had just lost control of a billion-dollar company, who was under regulatory scrutiny for financial misconduct, who was now filing legal harassment against a pregnant woman and her husband. The portrait that assembled itself across those paragraphs was not of a wrong man asserting his rights. It was of a man in the specific kind of free fall that ends when it ends, and not before. Tara left on a Sunday. She didn't fight about it. She packed 2 bags, called a car, and at the door she turned and looked at him with an expression that was more tired than angry, the look of someone who has been watching something go wrong for long enough that the ending is no longer a surprise. I hope you figure it out, she said, and she meant it, and then she left. Damien stood in the entry of his 30-floor apartment, and the city spread out behind the windows in every direction, 12 million lives moving at once, and none of them were paying any attention to him. His phone showed 17 unread messages. He put it face down on the counter. Somewhere across the city, in a brownstone on the Upper East Side that had been warmly, carefully, imperfectly made into a home, Evelyn Hart was having breakfast with her husband, and outside the window the morning was gray and cold, and neither of them knew yet exactly what the next few months would hold, but they were facing it together, which was the only arrangement that had ever made anything survivable. And in the morning light, with her hand resting on her belly and Nathan's voice low across the kitchen table, Evelyn looked up at the window and thought, not about Damien, not about the legal filing, not about any of it, but about the particular quality of quiet that surrounds a life that is exactly where it is supposed to be. She didn't know how rare that quiet was. She was still learning it, but she was learning. The legal filing sat in Evelyn's hands for about 40 seconds before she set it on the kitchen table and pushed it toward the center, away from her coffee cup, as though proximity to it might contaminate something. Nathan was standing at the counter. He had read it already. His attorney had called at 7 that morning before Evelyn was even awake. And Nathan had taken the call in the hallway and spoken in a low voice for 11 minutes while she slept. When she came downstairs, the document was on the table, and he was making coffee with the specific focused attention of a man keeping himself very still. He's claiming paternity, she said. Not a question. That's what it says. She looked at the document again. The words on the page were legal language, dense and procedural, but underneath them was something that wasn't language at all. It was a hand reaching across 2 years of distance, trying to pull her back into a version of herself she had worked very hard to leave behind. We were divorced for 2 years before I even met you, she said. I know. His own attorneys had to have told him this goes nowhere. His own attorneys, Nathan said, setting a mug in front of her, have been losing arguments with him for the past 2 weeks. He sat down across from her. His expression was steady, but she could see around the edges of it, the controlled anger, the kind he kept on a short leash because he understood that unleashing it served nothing. He's not doing this because he thinks he can win. He's doing it because it's the only move he has left that puts your name next to his. Evelyn looked at her hands, then at the window, then at the document. I'm not going to let this stress me out. I'm not going to let him... She stopped. Started again. Our son doesn't need his name attached to anything. He won't be. You sound very certain. Nathan looked at her steadily. I am very certain. She almost smiled at that. Almost. You know what the worst part is? He doesn't even want a child. He never did. That was... She stopped again, and this time the stop had more weight to it. The kind that happens when a thought arrives, connected to something older and more painful than the present conversation. Nathan waited. That was one of the things, she said finally, quietly, that I spent a long time not letting myself think about. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would have been better than the silence and the warmth of his hand. The legal response filed by Evelyn and Nathan's attorneys 12 days later was not aggressive. It was methodical. And in its methodical quality, the precise, detailed, document-by-document precision of it, there was something more devastating than any aggressive response could have been. It did not argue against Damien's claim so much as dismantle the premise on which the claim rested, piece by piece, in the organized and unhurried manner of people who are not afraid of examination. The court date was set for a Tuesday in March, the kind of gray morning that New York does well, where the light never quite commits to arriving and the cold has an edge that makes everything feel provisional. Evelyn was 7 months pregnant by then. She had taken to moving carefully, not because she was fragile, she wasn't, and disliked being treated as if she were, but because her body had developed its own new center of gravity, and she was still negotiating with it. Nathan was beside her on the courthouse steps. Their attorney, a woman named Carol Reyes, who had been doing family law for 28 years and had the quiet, load-bearing composure of someone who had heard everything twice, walked slightly ahead of them and exchanged efficient sentences with her associate. Damien was already inside. Evelyn had expected that seeing him in a formal legal context would feel different from seeing him in a restaurant. She had rehearsed several internal versions of how she would hold herself, what her face would do. But when she walked into the courtroom and saw him sitting at the opposing table in a suit that was still expensive despite everything, the suit was the last thing to go, she thought. It was always the last thing. What she felt was not anger, not satisfaction, not even the complicated grief she had braced for. What she felt was tired, a specific clean tiredness, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but from recognizing something you have been circling for a very long time and finally seeing it clearly. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically, but there was something missing from the way he occupied space, some energy that had always radiated off him like heat from a surface that had been sitting in the sun. That energy was gone now, or diminished, and what remained was just a man in a courtroom who had made a series of decisions and was now sitting inside the consequences of them. Stuart Freed was beside him, maintaining the practiced neutrality of an attorney whose private opinion of the case he was arguing had been stated clearly to his client on multiple occasions and then overridden. Stuart was doing his job. Whatever he felt about doing it wasn't written on his face. The proceedings opened. Judge Marin Holloway presided, a woman in her early 60s whose courtroom manner was so precise it was almost musical, each ruling and direction landing exactly where she intended it and nowhere else. She had been a family court judge for 19 years. She had seen the particular architecture of this kind of case before. Stuart presented Damien's position. It took 22 minutes. The core argument was built on the calculation of dates, the technical timeline of Evelyn's pregnancy mapped against the period when she and Damien were technically still legally married, and on the assertion that paternity should be formally established regardless of the presumptive facts as a matter of legal due diligence. Judge Holloway listened without expression. Carol Reyes stood and began the response, and where Stuart's presentation had been built on technical argument, Carol's was built on evidence. She walked through the divorce timeline with clean efficiency. Then she produced the first document. It was a certification from a reproductive endocrinologist at a clinic in Midtown Manhattan, dated 14 months before Damien filed his claim. The certification described the results of a medical evaluation. Damien had undergone a voluntary panel of blood work and physical assessment as part of what the clinic's records described as an ongoing wellness optimization program, a program aimed at, among other things, physical performance and hormonal profile. The results of that evaluation included, buried in a subsection of the hormone panel, findings consistent with significantly reduced sperm production. The evaluating physician had flagged it in the notes. The notation was clear and medical and unambiguous, and it used language that left very little room for alternative interpretation. Carol set the certification on the table before the judge. The courtroom was not loud. Courtrooms rarely were. But there is a particular quality to the silence in a small legal space when something irrevocable has just been placed on record, a tightening, a collective held breath. And that quality was present now. Damien's face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that, too long practiced in the specific discipline of not showing things. But something happened around his eyes, some microscopic adjustment, and Stuart Freed set down his pen slowly. Carol continued. The wellness optimization program, she explained, was not Damien's only relevant medical history. She produced a second set of records, these from a different clinic stretching back approximately 6 years, documenting a course of treatments that the records described as part of an appearance enhancement protocol. Hormone therapies, performance compounds, the kind of regimen that certain men pursued when they decided that the natural arc of aging was an opponent to be defeated, rather than a fact to be accepted. She was not editorializing, she was reading from the records. The editorial quality emerged entirely from the facts themselves, without her assistance. A note in the records from 3 years prior, from a consulting physician who had apparently reviewed the cumulative treatment history, read, in plain clinical language, patient's treatment history carries material risk of long-term impact on reproductive function. Patient informed and declined to modify protocol. Damien had been told. He had been told, and he had continued, and he had never told Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at the surface of the table in front of her. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not looking at Damien, and she was not looking at the documents, and her expression was very still in a way that was not blankness, but rather the opposite of it, a face containing too much to show any of it. Because what Carol Reyes was reading into the court record was not just the reason Damien's legal claim was baseless. It was the answer to a question Evelyn had carried for years. Years of treatments and hope and grief and self-recrimination and 2 doctors in 2 different cities and 1 specialist who had told her, gently, that sometimes these things don't have explanations. Years of lying awake wondering what was wrong with her body, what she was doing wrong, why this one thing wouldn't work. Years of asking herself quietly whether she was somehow inadequate in a way she couldn't name. The answer had been in a medical file. The answer had been in a medical file that Damien had possessed and not told her, not because he had protected her from it, but because telling her would have meant looking at something he didn't want to look at, because telling her would have interrupted the story he was telling himself about himself, because keeping the silence was easier than the conversation. She had spent years grieving something that was never hers to grieve. Nathan put his hand briefly on her arm under the table. Not long, just long enough to be there. Judge Holloway reviewed the documents for 3 minutes in complete silence. Then she set them down and looked at Stuart Freed, and what she said was quiet and surgical and final. Counsel, given the medical documentation entered into record, the court finds no basis for the paternity claim as filed. The biological facts are not in dispute. She paused. Furthermore, I want to note for the record that this filing appears to have been made without evidentiary foundation, and the court will be examining whether sanctions under Rule 11 are appropriate. Is there anything further from the petitioner? Stuart stood. No, Your Honor. Motion dismissed. She brought the gavel down once, cleanly, and that was the end of it. Damien sat in his chair for a moment after the room began to move. Stuart was gathering papers beside him, speaking in a low tone about the sanctions question, about next steps, about what needed to happen in the next 48 hours given the regulatory situation and the board and the other matters stacking up outside this courtroom. Stuart was doing the job Stuart did, and the words were professionally calibrated and practically framed. Damien wasn't hearing them. He was looking at the medical documents on the table, the ones that had been in a file in a clinic for 6 years, the ones a physician had shown him on a Tuesday afternoon, and that he had looked at for approximately 60 seconds before saying, I understand, and signing the form and going back to his car and calling his trainer to ask about the weekend schedule. He had known for 6 years. He had known, and Evelyn hadn't, and she had spent those 6 years in fertility clinics asking what was wrong with her. He sat with that fact. He had no choice but to sit with it, because it was in the record now, and it belonged to the category of things that could not be unsaid, could not be redirected or reframed or explained into a different shape. It was just true, and it was his. And it sat in his chest with a weight that was entirely different from the weight of losing the company, or the board vote, or the market, or any of the other things that had been collapsing around him for weeks. Those things had felt like injuries. This felt like something else. He didn't go to the press briefing his communications team had arranged outside the courthouse. He told Stewart to handle it, which Stewart did with minimal visible discomfort, telling the 3 journalists who had come that the matter had been resolved and there would be no further comment. The journalists looked mildly disappointed and then filed their 6-paragraph pieces anyway. Damien went home in the back of a car and sat in his apartment and didn't turn on any lights. Outside the courthouse, in the gray March air, Evelyn stood with Nathan and Carol for a few minutes while the logistics of the next steps were handled. Paperwork, timelines, the procedural housekeeping that followed a dismissal. Carol was efficient and thorough, and gave Evelyn a look at the end of their conversation that contained something human underneath the professional courtesy, something that acknowledged the particular weight of what had just been read into the record in that courtroom. "How are you feeling?" Nathan asked when they were finally alone, waiting for the car. Evelyn considered the question. "Strange," she said. "Strange how?" She thought about how to say it. "I spent a long time thinking something was wrong with me. Not just the medical thing, all of it, the way he used to look at me, the way things felt in that house. I kept thinking if I just adjusted something, did something differently, then it would work." She shook her head slightly. "And it turned out the thing I was trying to fix wasn't mine." Nathan didn't say it wasn't her fault, which was what most people would have said. He understood that she already knew that, and that hearing it wasn't the point. Instead, he said, "Do you feel lighter?" She thought about it honestly. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." The car arrived. Nathan held the door and she got in carefully, and as the car pulled away from the courthouse, she looked out at the gray city moving past the window and let herself feel all of it, the complicated anatomy of relief and grief and anger and something that was not quite forgiveness, but was in the same neighborhood, something that said, "This is over," and the overness itself is its own kind of answer. She didn't know it yet, but she would feel lighter. The week Nathan had asked about would come, and she would wake up on a Wednesday morning and realize that the particular weight she had been carrying was gone, and that the absence of it was so clean it almost hurt. But that was still a week away. The rest of the day moved with the specific unreality of days that have contained too much before noon. She ate lunch. She rested. She called her sister in Philadelphia, who had been following everything from a distance, and who said thank God when Evelyn told her the ruling, then immediately said, don't stress, sit down, drink water, in the way sisters do when they are afraid and relieved at the same time. Meanwhile, the world that had been building toward Damien Cross for months continued its motion toward him. The regulatory investigation, the one that Patricia Rahe had obliquely flagged in that early morning meeting with the careful language about questions that required legal presence, had been deepening since January. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been working through a document request that Cross Industries' legal team had been managing with the procedural precision of a controlled retreat, slowing the disclosure timeline without technically obstructing it. But the Harbor Line cancellation had accelerated the timeline, and the board's removal of Damien's operational authority had opened doors within the company's document systems that previously had remained closed. What the investigators found in those systems was not a single dramatic revelation. It was a pattern. The pattern was the kind that assembles itself out of 100 individually defensible decisions that, viewed in sequence, stopped being defensible. Forward revenue projections presented to investors as substantially more certain than internal communications suggested. Timing on certain stock transactions by executives close to Damien that coincided with the periods before material announcements in ways the statistical distribution suggested were not coincidental. A set of intercompany transfers in the fourth quarter of the previous year that had been structured in a manner that Patricia Rahe, who had known about them and had flagged them internally twice and had been overruled, would later describe to investigators with the measured precision of someone who had been waiting a long time to be asked. The formal notice arrived at Damien's apartment on a Thursday morning in late March. 6 weeks after the courtroom, 6 weeks in which he had been living in a strange, suspended state, his name still on the door but nothing behind it, his financial advisors in increasingly strained conversations with creditors, his personal accounts under pressure from legal fees that had become substantial. Stewart called him at 8:15. "The SEC has issued a formal notice of charges," he said. "Securities fraud. We knew this was coming. I need you in my office at 10. Damien was sitting in the kitchen in yesterday's clothes. He had stopped maintaining the routine several weeks ago. The 7:15 start, the perfectly pressed suit, the calibrated performance of purposeful occupation. It had happened gradually, which was the way most things happened when they happened for real. First the suit, then the schedule, then the morning coffee untouched because there was nowhere it needed to prepare him to go. "What are the charges exactly?" he said. Stewart told him. It took 4 minutes. When Stewart finished, Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the realistic outcome? If we fight it, the timeline is 18 months to trial, and the evidence they have is substantial. If we negotiate, we're looking at a significantly different set of options." Stewart paused. "Damien, I need you to hear me right now, not the version of you that has been overriding my advice for 4 months. I need you to actually hear me." "I'm hearing you." "Fighting this is not a strategy, it is a preference. And it's a preference based on the same instinct that filed that paternity claim, and you know how that ended." Damien didn't say anything. "The question is not whether you made mistakes," Stewart continued. "The question is what kind of man you want to be on the other side of this." That sentence landed in a way Stewart might not have fully intended. Or maybe he did. Stewart was not an unintelligent man, and he had known Damien for 15 years, and he had watched the last 4 months happen with a front row seat. Damien looked at the kitchen counter. There was a cup with coffee in it from yesterday. He had not bothered to throw it out. "Let me think," he said. "You have until Monday," Stewart said. He had until Monday. Outside the apartment, the city continued its indifferent business. Nathan Ashford's legal team was in conversations with Cross Industries' creditor group about a potential acquisition of the company's primary assets, conversations that were moving efficiently, as Nathan's conversations tended to do, because the assets themselves had value underneath the wreckage of Damien's decisions. The shipping routes, the logistics contracts, the infrastructure that Damien had built, which was genuinely good infrastructure, built by a man who, before everything else, had actually understood his industry. That was the complicated part that nobody in the press coverage managed to capture cleanly. Damien had been genuinely talented. He had built something real, and the decisions that had dismantled it were not the decisions of a stupid man. They were the decisions of a man who had confused his talent with a larger kind of rightness, who had moved from "I am good at this" to "I am exempt from consequences" in gradations so small he had never noticed the crossing. Patricia Ree resigned in April, once the regulatory agreement allowed it. She went to a boutique financial consulting firm and did not take any of her Cross Industries files with her, which was legally required. But she also did not take anything of Damien's with her in the less measurable sense. She had said what she needed to say to the investigators, in the precise language of someone who had waited a long time for the right question, and then she had closed that chapter and begun the next one. The Cross Industries brand was quietly retired, the assets transferred. The tower on Park Avenue that had held 42 floors of Damien's ambition was under new management by summer. The people who had worked there, the analysts and assistants and operations staff who had come in every morning and done their jobs and had nothing to do with any of it, found other positions, most of them, because talent finds places to land. The machine continued. It always did. And Damien Cross sat in an apartment that was 1/3 the size of his previous one. The Park Avenue apartment had been surrendered in the financial restructuring, along with the house in the Hamptons and the car and the accounts, and he read the charges against him and the proposed terms of the negotiated agreement and the projected sentencing range, if he pleaded, and he sat with all of it for a weekend. On Sunday evening, he called Stewart. "I'll take the negotiated plea," he said. Stewart was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, and then with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was close to it. "I think that's right." Damien sat by the window of his smaller apartment after he hung up. The lights of the city were coming on in the dusk, the same lights he had looked down on for years from 40 floors higher, and they looked different from this altitude. Not worse, just different, more level, more like he was among them rather than above them. He had a thought, sitting there, that he couldn't have articulated cleanly and didn't try to. It was something about the enormous energy he had spent for how many years, constructing and maintaining the particular version of himself he had presented to the world. The suits, the office, the restaurant tables where everyone could see you, the girlfriend who was evidence of something, the constant positioning, the constant calculation, the machinery of an identity built on what other people saw when they looked at you. And underneath all of it, this. A man in a smaller apartment watching the city lights come on, having spent everything with what remained to be discovered. He didn't know what remained yet. That was the part he couldn't see from where he was sitting. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't trying to see past it, or redirect around it, or explain it into a better shape. He just sat there, in the quiet, and let it be what it was. The plea agreement sat on the table between Damien and Stuart for a long time before either of them spoke. It was a Tuesday morning in early May, and the light in Stuart's conference room was the flat, institutional kind that made everything look equally without warmth. The document was 41 pages. Stuart had walked him through it the previous Thursday, then again on Friday via phone, and Damien had read it himself 3 times over the weekend with the specific grinding concentration of a man trying to find an exit in a room that didn't have one. There wasn't one. He had understood that intellectually for weeks. He was finishing the understanding emotionally now, which was taking longer. The sentencing range under the agreement is 30 to 42 months, Stuart said for the 3rd time, because Damien had asked him to say it again each time they met. Not because he had forgotten, because hearing it repeatedly was doing something for him that he couldn't have named. Wearing it smooth, maybe, making it real through repetition in a way it hadn't been real when it was still just a number on a page. And the judge has discretion within that range, Damien said. Correct. The agreement recommends 30 months, but the judge is not bound by it. She could go higher within the range. Or lower. Theoretically, but given the scope of the charges and the impact on investors, I wouldn't build expectations on lower. Stuart folded his hands on the table. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired, with the permanently contained manner of a man who had delivered difficult news so many times it had become a kind of weather he moved through rather than something that surprised him. Damien, there's one other element of the sentencing phase we need to discuss. Well, character references. Yes. Damien had known this was coming. He had been knowing it for 2 weeks and arranging reasons not to think about it directly. Who have we identified? Stuart opened a folder. We have a letter from your former CFO at Cross Industries prior to Patricia Ree, Gerald Mack. He left the company in good standing 12 years ago, before the practices under investigation were established. His letter speaks to your competence and early leadership. That's it? Stuart looked at him steadily. That's what we have that will hold up under scrutiny. He paused. Several people we initially approached declined. Damien didn't ask who. He could construct the list without asking. There's one other avenue we haven't discussed, Stuart said. He set down the folder. Evelyn? The name landed in the conference room like a stone dropped into still water. No, Damien said immediately. I'm not suggesting you have a right to ask her. I'm telling you it's an option that exists and that I'm obligated to put on the table. She has no reason to. No, Stuart agreed. She doesn't. But a character reference from your former spouse, particularly given the public nature of the legal proceedings between you and the media coverage of those proceedings, would carry significant weight with the judge. It would reframe the narrative. He paused again. I'm not telling you to ask her. I'm telling you what the calculus is. Damien looked out the window. 53rd floor, Midtown Manhattan. He could see across to another building's windows, and in one of them a woman was standing at her desk talking on the phone, moving her hands as she spoke. Just a person doing a Tuesday. I'll think about it, he said. He thought about it for 3 days. The thinking was not comfortable. Asking Evelyn anything required him to approach a territory he had been avoiding with the same energy he had once applied to building the company, which was to say, enormous energy, sustained over years, successfully disguised as forward motion. The territory was simple and terrible. He had treated her badly. Not badly in the way people sometimes meant when they said it, the vague, insufficient shorthand for ordinary human failure. Badly in ways that were specific and documented, and that he had, for years organized his self-narrative around not examining too directly. He had married her because she was the kind of woman he believed a man at his level was supposed to have. Stable, intelligent, graceful, not threatening. He had then spent their marriage slowly making her smaller to fit a space that suited him. The fertility years, and he could not think about those years now without the particular nausea of the thing he had known and not said. He had managed by redirecting Evelyn's grief into a general acknowledgement that sometimes things didn't work out. While privately continuing a hormone protocol a physician had flagged as potentially responsible for those exact things not working out. He had not told her because telling her would have required him to accept something about himself. And accepting things about himself had never been his strong suit. That was the clean version of what he had done. It was still bad enough. He called her on a Thursday morning. He had her number because the divorce had been finalized rather than erased. There was practical communication that occasionally required it, residual administrative threads. She picked up on the fourth ring, and he could hear the quality of sound around her. A house, daytime, somewhere domestic. "Damien," she said. Her voice was careful, but not hostile. "I know you don't have any reason to take this call," he said. I picked up. "Yes." He hadn't prepared what to say next. He had thought he had, but standing at his own window in his smaller apartment with the phone against his ear, the prepared words had evaporated. "The plea agreement has a sentencing phase. My attorney identified some potential character witnesses." "I've heard from his office," she said. Of course she had. Stewart had sent a formal inquiry to Carol Reyes because Stewart was methodical about procedural courtesy, even in situations that were uncomfortable. "I wanted to call you directly," Damien said, "instead of letting it go through the attorneys." "Okay." "I'm not going to ask you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling to ask." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you calling?" He stood there with that question. It was a good question. He had told himself he was calling out of directness, out of basic human decency, to make sure she wasn't receiving this through intermediaries. All of that was true, as far as it went. "I think I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, without it being connected to a request. Another pause. Longer this time. "The fertility treatments," he said, and the words cost something significant to produce. I knew there was a problem on my end. I didn't tell you. I let you go through all of it not knowing, and that was..." He stopped. Started again. "There's no version of that I can explain. I just needed you to know that I know what it was." The silence on the other end was not comfortable, and he didn't try to make it so. "Okay," she said finally. Just that word. He had expected more. Anger, or the careful professional distance she had maintained in the courtroom, or something else he could react to. The okay was harder than either of those things because it was honest. It was the sound of a person receiving information they already knew and have already processed and have moved beyond. And it made him feel the distance between where she was and where he was with a clarity that other versions of the conversation would have obscured. "Take care of yourself," she said. And then, after a beat, "I'll think about the letter." She hung up. He stood in the apartment for a while after. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, and the room was quiet, and he was 53 years old with 30 to 42 months of a federal sentencing recommendation in front of him, and an ex-wife who had said she'd think about a letter with the same calm tone one might use to discuss a scheduling question. He sat down on the couch. He put his phone face down on the cushion beside him. He didn't pick it back up for 2 hours. Evelyn told Nathan about the call that evening. They were in the kitchen again. They did a lot of their real talking in the kitchen, she had noticed, the counter between them. Something to do with their hands, the ordinary activities of a life providing a kind of permission for the harder conversations to happen alongside them. Nathan was cutting vegetables. He set down the knife when she finished telling him. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet." He was quiet, giving her room for the not knowing. "He sounded different," she said. Not reformed, not like a movie, just different. Like someone who hasn't been sleeping and has stopped pretending he has. That might be what he needs you to see." "Maybe." She leaned against the counter. Their son was asleep upstairs. James, 6 weeks old, currently the most demanding and least apologetic resident of the brownstone, who had reorganized their entire existence around his own schedule with the absolute authority of the newly arrived. Or maybe he just ran out of other options, and I'm the last door. She paused. Both things can be true. Nathan picked up the knife again. They usually are. She wrote the letter 2 days later. She sat at the desk in the small room that had been a study and was now partially a nursery and would eventually need to decide what it was, and she wrote it by hand first, then typed it, then sat looking at the typed version for a long time before she made any decisions about it. It was not a glowing letter. It was not the kind of character reference that painted a subject in the best possible light through selective memory. Carol had advised her that such letters, when they came from people with Evelyn's particular history with the defendant, were sometimes viewed skeptically by judges precisely because the selectivity was visible. What carried weight, Carol said, was specificity and honesty, the kind of letter that acknowledged complexity rather than dissolved it. So Evelyn wrote honestly. She wrote about a man who had been genuinely intelligent and capable and who had built something real. She wrote about the ways his ambition had served him and the ways it had not. She wrote, and this was the hardest paragraph, the one she rewrote 4 times, that she believed human beings were capable of change, not always, not on demand, but under the right conditions of genuine reckoning, and that the man she had spoken with on the phone had sounded to her like someone in the early, uncomfortable, unperformative stages of that process. She did not say he was good, she said he was trying. She sent it to Carol, who sent it to Stuart, who read it twice before forwarding it to the court, and who then sat at his own desk for a moment thinking that in 23 years of practice he had never received a character reference quite like it. The sentencing hearing was on a Wednesday in June. The courtroom was the same building, different room, smaller than the one where the paternity case had been heard, more austere. Damien sat at the defendant's table in a suit that was still good quality, though it was one of the 3 he had kept when everything else had been liquidated. His shoes were polished. He had shaved carefully that morning. These were the things he still knew how to do, the maintenance of surfaces, even when the surfaces had stopped meaning what they once did. Judge Holloway was not presiding over this case. The sentencing judge was a man named Arthur Crane, in his late 60s, who had spent 30 years as a federal judge and who read every document in a case before he opened his mouth in a courtroom. He had read the 41-page plea agreement. He had read the SEC's summary of findings, which was 73 pages. He had read the character letter from Gerald Mack, which was adequate and said what it needed to say without saying more. And he had read Evelyn's letter. He didn't reference it directly during proceedings. Judges rarely did. But Stuart, watching from across the room with the professional attention of someone who had spent years reading judicial body language, noticed that Judge Crane held Evelyn's letter separately from the rest of the sentencing file, and that he glanced at it once during the prosecutor's presentation, and that his expression during that glance was thoughtful in a way that wasn't arithmetical. The prosecutor's presentation was measured and complete. It covered the timeline of misconduct, the investor impact. $37 million in investor losses were attributed directly to the misleading projections, the regulatory failures, the pattern of decisions that had built the violation. It was not theatrical. It didn't need to be. The facts were theatrical enough on their own. Stuart's presentation and mitigation took 20 minutes. He spoke about Damien's early career, the company he had built, the employment he had provided. He spoke about the negotiated plea and its indication of acceptance of responsibility. He read a portion of Gerald Mack's letter. He submitted Evelyn's letter without reading from it. Then it was Damien's turn. This was the part Stuart had worked on with him for 3 weeks. The allocution, the defendant's statement to the court before sentencing, was, Stuart had explained, both the hardest and most consequential part of the proceeding. It was the one moment of pure unmediated exposure, the place where every prepared word could be heard in the room for exactly what it was, and where the difference between performed contrition and actual reckoning was visible to anyone who had been doing this long enough. Judge Crane had been doing it long enough. Damien stood. He had prepared notes. He had written and rewritten them over the course of 3 weeks, in the evenings in the smaller apartment, at the kitchen table with the notes spread around him in the specific disorder of a man trying to find the true sentence inside a pile of adequate ones. Stewart had reviewed the final version and had said, quietly, that he thought it was right. "Your Honor," Damien said. His voice was steady. He had expected it not to be, and the steadiness wasn't relief. It was just the body doing what it knew, the professional muscle memory that had carried him through 1,000 difficult rooms. He recognized it and let it carry him here, while trying to make sure it carried him honestly rather than effectively. "I've spent a significant part of my life being very good at explaining things," he said, "making a case, framing a situation in the best possible light. I was good at it because I worked at it, and because for a long time it worked." He paused. "Not for effect, because the next part required a different kind of access. What I did to the investors who trusted me with their money was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a miscalculation, not wrong in the sense of optimistic projections that didn't pan out. Wrong in the sense that I knew what I was representing and I represented it differently, and I made that choice deliberately, and I made it because the alternative was an admission of vulnerability I wasn't willing to make." He looked at the pages in his hands and then set them down on the table. "I'm 53 years old. I've built things I was genuinely proud of. I've also spent a lot of that time treating people as either useful or irrelevant, and believing that I was somehow exempt from the kind of accountability I would have applied to anyone else." The courtroom was quiet. Not tense. Something more still than tense. "I don't have a conversion story to offer," he said. "I'm not standing here as someone who has figured out what I did wrong and corrected it. I'm standing here as someone who is, I think for the first time, actually looking at it. That's slower and less satisfying than a redemption arc, but it's what's honest." He picked up the notes again, then put them back down. "I understand the sentence. I accept it. I'm prepared to serve it." He paused once more. "That's all." He sat down. Stewart said nothing. The prosecutor said nothing. Judge Crane looked at his documents for a moment, then looked at Damien. "Mr. Cross," the judge said, "in 30 years on this bench I have heard a great many allocutions. Some of them were carefully written performances. Some of them were genuine. Some were both simultaneously, which is perhaps the most complicated category." He folded his hands. "The court has reviewed all submitted materials, including the character submissions. The court notes the unusual nature of the submission from your former spouse, which the court will simply describe as among the more honest documents it has received in this context." He opened the sentencing order. "On count 1, securities fraud. The court sentences you to 32 months in federal prison. The recommendation of the plea agreement has been noted. The court deviates slightly upward from the recommended minimum in recognition of the scope of investor impact, and declines to go higher in recognition of the acceptance of responsibility reflected in the plea and the allocution." He continued through the secondary counts: fines, disgorgement of profits, 3 years of supervised release following imprisonment, prohibition from serving as a director or officer of any publicly traded company for 10 years. When he finished, he looked at Damien again. "The court has one final observation, not for the record." His tone had shifted marginally, something slightly less formal. "The capacity to look directly at what one has done, not to explain it, not to minimize it, is rarer than it should be in this courtroom. I hope that capacity serves you where you're going." He closed the folder. "Court is adjourned." The gavel. Stewart was at Damien's side immediately, and there were logistics, the timeline for surrender, the facility assignment, the administrative machinery that processed the transition between one kind of life and another. Damien answered the questions that required answers and signed what needed signing, and moved through the next 40 minutes on a kind of autopilot that was not numbness exactly, but was its closest functional equivalent. Outside the courthouse, in the June afternoon, which was warmer than any of the previous courthouse days had been, Stewart shook his hand. 32 months, Stewart said. "It could have been 42. "I know." The letter helped. Damien said nothing for a moment. "I know that too." Stewart looked at him with the professional evaluation of a man who has represented someone for a long time and is now standing at the end of a substantial chapter of that representation. "I'll be in contact about the supervised release terms. There are financial compliance obligations you'll need to maintain from inside." "I know." "Take care of yourself, Damien." He took a cab back to the smaller apartment. He had 31 days before he needed to report to the federal facility in Pennsylvania, a minimum security institution, the kind the press sometimes called a white-collar facility, which was a designation that always made Damien feel the particular discomfort of recognizing that even in federal sentencing, certain kinds of failure still came with cushions that other kinds didn't. He spent the 31 days doing things that were not dramatic. He packed what could be stored, arranged what couldn't. He settled remaining accounts. He had a long, difficult, honest conversation with his younger brother in Denver, a man named Carl, who had spent most of his adult life in Damien's peripheral vision, a middle school teacher with 3 kids and a mortgage, and a steady, moderate happiness that Damien had spent decades privately categorizing as a smaller life. In that phone call, which lasted an hour and 40 minutes, Carl did not say, "I told you so," because that was not who Carl was. But he did say, "I've been waiting a long time for you to sound like this," in a voice that was equal parts sad and relieved. Damien asked Carl if he would come visit. Carl said yes, of course, without hesitation, and the without hesitation was its own kind of information. He wrote a letter to Patricia Ree, not asking for anything, just acknowledging that she had tried to tell him more than once, and that he had not listened, and that her willingness to speak accurately to the investigators had been the right thing to do. He didn't expect a response. He sent it anyway. She responded 3 weeks later from inside the facility in a brief note that said she had received the letter and that she appreciated it, and that she hoped he found the time useful. It was professional and measured and had the quality of a door left slightly open rather than firmly closed, which was more than he had any right to expect. On the morning of his surrender date, Damien stood in the small apartment for a while before calling the car. The apartment was mostly empty, some furniture that would stay in storage, a few boxes at Carl's place in Denver. The windows faced east, and the morning light was coming through at a low angle, very bright, the kind of brightness that made everything in its path look very clean and very simple. He was 53 years old. He had 32 months ahead of him in a place that was not designed for comfort. He had lost more than he had imagined losing, and some of what he had lost he was only beginning to understand he had possessed. He had hurt people, specifically, in ways he was carrying with him as something heavier and more permanent than regret, as a fact about himself that he now had to decide what to do with. He did not know what came after. He genuinely didn't, which was new. He had always been a man who knew what came after, who planned 3 steps ahead of every present moment, who kept the future in a managed relationship with his own intentions. The absence of that knowledge was uncomfortable and clarifying in equal measure. He picked up the single bag he was allowed to bring. He had called Evelyn one more time a week earlier to thank her for the letter. He hadn't asked what it said. He had heard from Stuart in general terms, and that was enough. "You didn't have to do that," he had said. "I know," she had said. "How is the baby?" A brief pause. "He's good. He's—" And then something happened in her voice. A small, involuntary warmth that broke through the careful distance, the specific, helpless affection of a new parent. "He's a lot. He's very loud. He's the best thing I've ever seen." Damien had sat with that for a moment, not with jealousy, not with any of the complicated feelings that sentence might have produced in him months earlier, just with the simple weight of what it meant. Someone was having a good life. She was having a good life. She had fought her way to a version of herself that she deserved, and it had produced something real and loud and wonderful. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it. "Good luck, Damien," she said. He called the car. The federal facility in Morgantown, Pennsylvania sat at the edge of a long, flat valley where the mornings came in gray and slow, and the light, when it finally arrived, had a quality Damien had never noticed in any city he had lived in: patient, unhurried, indifferent to whether you were ready for it. He had been there for 11 days before he stopped counting them. The first week was the hardest in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not because of the physical conditions, the facility was what it was, structured and institutional and stripped of comfort without being actively punishing, but because of the silence inside his own head, which turned out not to be silence at all, but a very loud room he had been successfully avoiding for most of his adult life. Take away the schedule, the meetings, the calls, the performance of occupation, and what remained was a man sitting alone with the accumulated weight of every decision he had made, with nothing to do but look at them. He had read about this in the context of meditation, in one of those business-adjacent wellness articles his former life had occasionally produced on his desk, How stillness was difficult because it removed the noise that usually obscured what was actually happening inside a person. He had read it as a moderately interesting idea and moved on. Now he understood it as a physical fact. His bunk was in a room with 3 other men. One of them, a man named Harold, who had been a real estate developer in Atlanta before a tax fraud conviction, had been at Morgantown for 14 months and had the specific equanimity of someone who had already done the hardest adjustment and come out the other side of it. Harold was 58. He had a daughter who visited on the 3rd Sunday of every month and a wife who was deciding whether their marriage would survive. And he talked about both of those things with the same matter-of-fact honesty that he applied to everything else, as if pretense was a tool that had been confiscated on intake and he hadn't missed it much. "First month's the worst," Harold said on Damien's 5th day, when Damien was sitting on his bunk at 9 in the evening looking at the wall. "Not because anything particular happens, just because you realize how much work you were doing to not be alone with yourself." Damien looked at him. "That's a specific observation. I had a good therapist before I came in, tried to tell me the same thing for 2 years. Harold shrugged. "Sometimes you have to get here to hear it." Damien thought about Stuart telling him things for 4 months that he had overridden. He thought about Patricia Ree flagging the same financial concerns twice. He thought about a physician who had shown him a hormone panel and whom he had thanked and dismissed in the same 60-second window. "Yeah," he said, "I know something about that." Harold nodded, as though this was not surprising, and went back to his book. The facility had a library. It was not a large library, 3 metal shelving units and a table near a window that got good afternoon light. But it had a volunteer coordinator who came in twice a week, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Garland, who was 71 years old, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had opinions about books that she shared without being asked and without apology. She had been coordinating the library for 9 years and had the comfortable authority of someone who understood that she was providing something important in a place that wasn't designed to provide it. Damien started going to the library in his 3rd week, not for a specific book, just for the light through the window and the small displacement of having somewhere to go with intention. Mrs. Garland handed him a novel on his 2nd visit without preamble. "You look like you're in your head too much," she said. "Read something that isn't about you." He looked at the cover. It was a novel about a Korean-American family across 3 generations, quiet and detailed and unhurried, the kind of book that didn't announce its importance. "I usually read business books," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I gave you this one." He read it in 4 days. Then he read it again, more slowly, noticing things he'd missed the first time. The way certain small moments contained the entire weight of a relationship, the way the author trusted the reader to understand what wasn't said. He found himself sitting with individual pages longer than he ever had with anything he'd read before. He asked Mrs. Garland for something else. She gave it to him without comment, with the satisfied expression of someone whose prescription had worked. The reading became, over months, one of the fixed points of his days. Not an escape. He had tried escape routes in the first few weeks and found them unconvincing, the mental strategies of avoidance that had served him in his previous life and now felt like rooms with no air in them. Reading wasn't escape. It was more like a different kind of attention, one that asked him to be present in someone else's experience rather than managing his own. And that asking turned out to be good for him in ways he couldn't have predicted. Carl came to visit in September, 3 months after Damien's arrival. He drove up from the airport in a rental car and sat across from Damien in the visiting room. And for the first 10 minutes, they talked about Carl's kids. The oldest was applying to colleges. The middle one had started playing guitar badly and enthusiastically. And about Carl's wife, Teresa, who had sent a bag of homemade cookies through the facility's approved care package system. Then Carl looked at him across the table with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a younger brother who had spent a lifetime watching someone from a distance and now found himself in close range. "You look different," Carl said. "Different how?" Carl thought about it. "Like you're not performing anything." Damien sat with that. "I don't have much left to perform." "No, but some people keep doing it anyway." Carl leaned forward slightly. "I talked to Patricia Ree. She mentioned you wrote to her." "She told you that?" "I called her. I don't know why exactly. I think I wanted to understand what happened from someone who was there. Carl folded his hands on the table. She said the letter was, her exact word was unexpected. She said she's thought about it. He paused. She said she thinks you actually understood what you were apologizing for. Damien didn't say anything for a moment. I did, he said finally. I understand more of it now than when I wrote it. That's how it works, Carl said quietly. They talked for 2 hours about their parents, their father, who had been a demanding and withholding man who had shaped Damien's understanding of what success required without ever intending to explain the cost of that understanding. About decisions Damien had made at 25 and 30 that had seemed like competence and now looked, from the other side, like an early installation of the same avoidance architecture that had eventually produced everything else. Carl was not analytical about it. He was a middle school teacher, not a therapist, and he talked the way people talk when they're simply telling the truth, but the honesty of it was its own kind of precision. I always thought you had the better life, Carl said, near the end of the visit. The money, the position, what you built. He paused. Teresa and I talked about that a lot over the years, comparing. You shouldn't have, Damien said. No, probably not. But you know, Carl shrugged. Now I look at you here, and I look at what I'm going home to, and I realize the comparison was never real. We were measuring different things. What were you measuring? Surface, Carl said simply. Damien drove back to the facility from that conversation. The visiting room, then the corridor, then the room with the 3 bunks, and Harold was reading on his bunk. And outside the window, the late afternoon light was coming through at the same patient angle it always did. And Damien sat on his bunk and thought about Surface for a long time. He had spent 30 years building one of the most impeccable surfaces in the city of New York. He had polished it and maintained it and defended it, and eventually committed felonies to protect it. And his brother, who had a mortgage he had refinanced twice, and a daughter applying to state schools, and a wife who packed cookies into approved care packages for a brother she had never been particularly close to, his brother had a life that, from the inside, was full. Not perfect. Carl and Teresa had years of difficulty in the middle of their marriage that Carl mentioned quietly and without detail, the way couples do when they have been through something real and come out the other side still together, not because it was easy, but because they decided to. His oldest kid had struggled with anxiety through high school in ways that had cost them sleep and money and the particular specific fear of a parent watching a child suffer. Not perfect. Real. Damien lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling and admitted to himself, for the first time without immediate deflection, that he had never had that. Not in the marriage with Evelyn, not in the years before it, not in the company or the apartment or the restaurants where everyone could see him. He had had the surface. He had not had what was underneath it. He understood, lying there, that this was not a discovery that resolved anything. Understanding why you built a house of mirrors did not retroactively produce the house you should have built instead. It did not undo the investor losses or return the years Evelyn had spent in fertility clinics. It did not rebuild the professional lives of the people at Cross Industries who had not known what was happening and had simply come to work. But it was something. It was the beginning of an honest conversation with himself. And honest conversations, he was learning, were the only ones that went anywhere real. The months moved in the way time moves in institutional settings. Not fast, not slow, but with a particular evenness that becomes its own kind of rhythm. The days had structure, meals, work assignments, the library, the voluntary counseling sessions that Damien had been skeptical of, and then found himself attending twice a week with the regularity of someone who had discovered something was working. The counselor was a man named Dr. Reeves, mid-40s, unhurried in the specific way of someone who had heard most of what people could say and was not surprised by any of it. He didn't push. He asked questions and then waited, with a patience that Damien initially found uncomfortable. He was used to conversations that moved at his pace, that he could redirect, and then found useful. "You keep describing what you built," Dr. Reeves said in one of their sessions about 6 months in. "The company, the reputation. But when I ask you about relationships, you describe transactions." "I built those too." "I know. What do you think the difference is between building a company and building a relationship?" Damien thought about it honestly. Control, he said. A company does what the structure you build makes it do. A person... He stopped. A person doesn't, Dr. Reeves said. No. And your response to that was generally to choose people who would. It wasn't a question. Damien sat with it. Evelyn wasn't that, he said finally. No? She was herself. Even when I was doing everything possible to make her smaller, she was still herself underneath it. I think that's why He stopped again, started. I think that's why it bothered me so much to see her at that restaurant. Not because she had moved on, because she had come back to herself. And I knew what that meant about what had been happening while we were married. Dr. Reeves said nothing, which was his particular form of response. I thought I wanted someone who fit into the life I was building, Damien said. I didn't understand that what I was building wasn't a life. He said it to the room, to the afternoon light coming through the counselor's narrow window, and it had the quality of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being spoken aloud. Evelyn, across those months, was building something she hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted, and which turned out to be the most sustaining work of her life. James was not an easy infant. He was loud and opinionated and slept in intervals that defied logic and seemed personally designed to prevent his parents from reaching REM cycles. He had Nathan's dark eyes, and what Evelyn was fairly certain was her own father's stubbornness, deployed at 4 a.m. with absolute commitment. She was more tired than she had been in her life, and she was also more certain than she had ever been that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That certainty was not simple. She had moments, lying awake at 3 while Nathan walked James down the hallway in the particular swaying shuffle of a parent trying to navigate by instinct in the dark, where she thought about the years in the fertility clinics and felt the retroactive weight of them differently than she had before, not just as grief, but as time. Those years were hers, and they had cost her, and no piece of information revealed in a courtroom undid the spending of them. She talked to a therapist about it. Not a grief therapist specifically, just a person she had been seeing for 2 years who was useful in the particular way of someone who asked good questions and didn't flinch. She talked about the complicated arithmetic of moving forward while still knowing the full cost of what had happened. And the therapist said something that Evelyn wrote down afterward and kept. Healing doesn't mean the past becomes okay. It means the past stops running the present. She was still working on that. Nathan watched her work on it with the specific attention of a man who loved someone and understood that love was not the same as protection, that you couldn't absorb another person's difficult process, you could only be present for it. He was not always perfect at this. He was impatient sometimes, wanted to fix what couldn't be fixed, said the wrong thing occasionally, and then had to apologize and start over. They were two people with histories and habits and the ongoing negotiation of a shared life, and they got it wrong regularly enough to keep things honest. But they talked. That was the thing, the central load-bearing fact of their life together. They talked about things, including the uncomfortable ones, including the ones where they disagreed or where something one of them had done had cost the other something. They had learned early that the conversation was always less damaging than the silence, that the silence was where things built up into shapes that became hard to name. Nathan had learned that the hard way, from a previous marriage that had ended quietly and without drama, and that he had mourned in private for longer than he showed. He had been a different kind of unavailable in those years. Not cruel, not negligent, but so entirely absorbed in the building of Ashford Meridian that his wife had been, for years, technically present and practically alone. She had left without anger, and with a precision that told him she had been making her decision for a long time before she announced it. He had carried that with him. It had made him a different kind of partner to Evelyn, more attentive, more willing to stop and be in the room, more aware that the thing worth protecting wasn't the company or the position, but the person across the table. Ashford Meridian's acquisition of Cross Industries' assets was completed by the end of the first year. What Nathan had acquired was structural, the shipping routes, certain logistics infrastructure in the Northeast Corridor, a warehouse network that integrated cleanly with Meridian's existing operations. The Cross Industries name was retired entirely. The infrastructure was rebuilt under the Meridian umbrella, and the employees who remained were given contracts with terms that were different from what they had worked under before. Better benefits, transparent compensation structures, profit-sharing mechanisms that Evelyn had argued for and Nathan had agreed to, and their board had taken some convincing to accept. The board convincing had been a process. Evelyn had sat through 3 rounds of it, 7 months postpartum, in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of Meridian's tower, and she had made the case with numbers and then with something beyond numbers, with the argument that a company's most durable asset was the confidence of the people inside it, that employees who understood they were invested in rather than extracted from, built differently, worked differently, stayed. One board member, a man named Foster, who had been on the Meridian board for 12 years and who valued return metrics with an almost religious consistency, had looked at her across the table and said, "These are admirable values, Evelyn. They're not necessarily scalable." "Neither was the way we've been doing it," she said, "and we've been doing it that way for 30 years. She set the projections on the table. "These are the 5-year numbers under the proposed structure. The margin improvement in the 3rd year is conservative. I think it's understated." Foster had looked at the numbers. He had the particular expression of a man whose preference and whose arithmetic were arriving at different places. "We'll trial it in the Northeast Division," he said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Evelyn said. It worked. Not immediately, and not without friction. There were implementation problems. A regional manager in Connecticut who resisted the profit-sharing rollout with a stubbornness that required 3 separate conversations before he came around. Supply chain adjustments in the first quarter that cost them more than projected. It was messy in the way real change was always messy. But by the end of the 2nd year, the Northeast Division's employee retention numbers had shifted significantly, and turnover costs had dropped, and there was a measurable correlation between the compensation transparency initiative and productivity metrics that Foster looked at for a long time before saying, at the next board meeting, that the trial should be extended to 2 more regions. Evelyn didn't say "I told you so," because that wasn't what she was there for. James was 18 months old by then, walking with the unstable commitment of a person who had recently discovered that upright locomotion was available and was now applying it to every surface without discrimination. He had opinions about everything: which cup, which song, which parent was required for which function at which hour. And he expressed them with a directness that made Nathan laugh and Evelyn sometimes question her choices, and both of them, in the quiet moments after he was asleep, look at each other with the helpless gratitude of people who know something good has happened to them. Nathan had adopted James formally at 8 months. The paperwork was uncomplicated because Damien had been incarcerated and had, through Stewart, formally waived any claim. A waiver that carried, for Damien, the weight of one final accurate thing he could do. James Nathan Ashford was his name on the certificate, and it was the name on the small room in the brownstone with the yellow walls and the shelf of books he couldn't read yet but reached for anyway. It was in James's 2nd year that the letter arrived. It came to Nathan's office, addressed to Evelyn, forwarded through Stuart Freed's office with a brief cover note explaining its origin. The envelope was standard facility issue, handwritten in a print that was neater than she would have expected, as if someone had been deliberate about the writing. She opened it at the kitchen table, in the morning, with Nathan across from her and James in his high chair working with intense concentration on a piece of toast. It was 2 pages. She read it through once without stopping. It wasn't an apology, exactly, or rather, it contained one, but the apology wasn't the architecture of it. It was more like a report, an honest account of what the last 14 months had produced in a man who had gone in believing that the problem was everything outside of him and was slowly arriving at a more accurate inventory. He wrote about Harold and the library and the counselor and Carl's visit. He wrote about the novel Mrs. Garland had handed him and how he had read it twice and then found himself thinking about his mother, who had been a quiet reader and whom he had understood until relatively recently, almost entirely through the lens of how she had served or not served his needs as a child. He wrote about the physician's note in the medical file and how he had been living with that knowledge for 6 years in the way you live with something you've put in a drawer, knowing it's there, refusing to open the drawer, and how the drawer had finally, inevitably, been opened in a courtroom with everyone watching, and how there was a particular terrible mercy in things being forced into the open. He wrote, near the end, "I know you've moved on and that James is yours and Nathan's in every sense that matters. I know I forfeited the right to be part of that story before it even began. I'm not writing to reclaim anything. I'm writing because you were the person I most owe honesty to, and it's taken me this long to have some that's worth offering. And then in the final paragraph, I don't know who I am without the architecture I spent 30 years building. I'm finding out. It's slower than I expected and less linear, but I think it might be the first real thing I've done. Evelyn read it a second time. James threw a piece of toast from his high chair with considerable satisfaction and said something that wasn't quite a word but had a word's intention. "What does it say?" Nathan asked. She handed it across the table without speaking. He read it. She watched his face, which moved through several things and settled on something she had come to recognize as his thoughtful expression, not reaction, but consideration. The face he wore when he was taking something seriously enough to hold it for a moment before deciding what it meant. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'll tell you when I do." She thought about writing back for 3 weeks. She was not sure she should. There was a version of the argument where responding to Damien's letters was a door better left closed, not out of cruelty, but out of the practical wisdom of protecting what she had built from the complicated gravity of what she had left. Her therapist, when she talked about it, did not tell her what to do, but asked her what she wanted, which was typically unhelpful and typically correct. What she wanted was complicated. She wanted Damien to have the reckoning that was clearly happening to him because she believed in reckonings. She had been through her own, less dramatic but no less real, in the years of the marriage and the years of leaving and the years of building herself back into someone she recognized. She wanted that for him not from generosity exactly, but from the simple recognition that people who didn't reckon with themselves were dangerous, to themselves and to whoever was near them. She also wanted to be done. She wanted the energy that had previously been organized around the weight of that marriage to stay organized around James and Nathan and the work she was doing at Meridian and the ordinary, beautiful difficulty of the life she had built. She wrote back in the 4th week. It was shorter than his letter, 1 page. She told him she had received the letter and read it. She told him she was glad something useful was happening in the time he had. She told him, in plain language, that she didn't carry what had happened in the same way she once had, that it was past tense in the truest sense, that it lived in the category of things that had shaped her without defining her. She told him James was well, without details, because some things didn't need to be shared, and some boundaries were appropriate. And she told him one other thing, which she wrote last, and which she meant. The person you're describing in that letter, the one trying to figure out who he is without the performance, I think he was always in there. I think you just never had a reason to look. She folded the letter, addressed the envelope, and put it in the mail. Nathan was in the kitchen when she came back inside. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He handed her coffee. Damien received the letter on a Thursday. He read it in the library, in the afternoon light, at the table by the window. He read it slowly, the way he had learned to read things in the past year and a half, with his full attention, without simultaneously managing his reaction. When he finished, he sat for a while. "Good news?" Mrs. Garland asked from the shelving unit, where she was cataloging returns with the organized efficiency she brought to everything. "Not news exactly," he said. "More like," he looked for the word, "a door opening." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Well," she said, "that's something." He had 14 months remaining. He knew the countdown because Harold kept a quiet, unsentimental calendar, not obsessively, but practically. Planning for what would need to happen on the other side required knowing when the other side arrived. Harold's wife had decided to try, which Harold talked about with a careful hope that was more honest than optimism, and Harold's daughter visited on the 3rd Sunday like clockwork, and Harold was building something in his mind for what came next, smaller than what he'd had before, scaled differently, made of different materials. Damien was building too, in his limited way. He had started teaching a basic financial literacy workshop through the Facilities Education Program, twice a month, a handful of men learning the difference between assets and liabilities, how interest worked, why the decisions that seemed like shortcuts rarely were. He was not a skilled teacher. He talked too fast occasionally and had a tendency to explain at a level that assumed more base knowledge than was present, and he was working on both of those things with the same methodical attention he had once applied to quarterly projections. But the men in the workshop were paying attention, and occasionally one of them asked a question that stopped him, a real question, about a real situation, about what to do when the system you were re-entering had not been designed with your success in mind. And he found, in sitting with those questions, that his own thinking was changing, becoming less theoretical, more connected to the actual texture of what a life cost and what it required. He wrote to Carl about it. Carl wrote back that he wasn't surprised, that Damien had always been better with real problems than abstract ones. He had just surrounded himself with abstractions his whole life. Damien read that letter standing at his bunk and laughed out loud for the first time in a long time. A real laugh, the kind that wasn't managed, that arrived before he could decide whether it was appropriate. Harold looked up from his book. "Good mail day," Damien said. "Those are good," Harold agreed. Outside the window, the Pennsylvania afternoon was doing what it did. Patient, unhurried, indifferent to whether you were ready for it. The light came through at its regular angle, the same light that had been there every day, and it occurred to Damien, standing there with his brother's letter in his hand, that he had spent the first weeks of his sentence waiting for the days to end, and was now spending them differently. Not resigned to them, not merely enduring them, but actually inside them, which was a distinction that sounded small and was not. He had a conversation once, near the end of his first year, with a man named Elijah, who worked the morning kitchen shift and who had been at Morgantown for 3 years, and who had a stillness about him that Damien had initially mistaken for resignation and had eventually understood was something else entirely. "What do you do with it?" Damien had asked him, not explaining what it was. He thought Elijah would understand. Elijah had thought about it for a moment. "I stopped fighting the before," he said. "The before is the before. It doesn't change. Spending energy on it is—" He made a small gesture with his hand, like releasing something. "So I put the energy here, what I can actually affect." Damien had thought about that for weeks. He thought about it when he taught the financial literacy class, and watched a man named Marcus, 26 years old and sharper than anyone Damien had employed at Cross Industries, work through a compound interest problem and arrive at the answer with the focused satisfaction of someone building a tool they intend to use. He thought about it when he read, which was now a daily practice, an hour minimum, books that Mrs. Garland selected and occasionally books he selected himself, working through a kind of reading life he had never had time for when he was too busy managing the surface. He thought about it in the counseling sessions with Dr. Reeves, where the conversations had moved, over 14 months, from the architecture of what Damien had done to the more foundational question of what kind of man he intended to be with the years he had remaining, which were, actuarially speaking, a substantial number. That question, what kind of man with what was left, was not answerable in a session or a letter or a clear articulation. It was a practice. He was beginning to understand that most of the important things were. The world continued outside the valley. Ashford Meridian's Northeast Division profit-sharing model was extended company-wide in James's second year. Evelyn presented the proposal to the full board with Nathan beside her and Foster in the third seat from the left. And this time Foster asked questions about the implementation timeline rather than the premise, which told her everything she needed to know about where things had arrived. The company grew, not explosively, not in the way that produced magazine covers and acquisition rumors, but solidly. The kind of growth that compounded because it was built on something real, on people who stayed and improved and recruited others like them, and built knowledge that didn't walk out the door every 18 months looking for a larger number somewhere else. Evelyn's title was Chief Strategy Officer. She had been offered the co-CEO designation twice and had declined both times, not from false modesty, but from clear-eyed understanding of what she was good at and where she added most. She was a builder of systems and a reader of human beings, and the strategy role let her do both of those things without the administrative overhead of the top designation, and Nathan ran the company with the same steady competence he had always had, and they worked well together in the particular way that required them to disagree regularly and meant something because of it. James turned 2 and then 3, and his vocabulary expanded with the aggressive efficiency of a small person who had decided that language was the primary tool and intended to deploy it constantly. He called Nathan Dada with such absolute confidence that it made Nathan quiet sometimes in a way that Evelyn recognized as the emotional equivalent of overflow, too much coming in for the normal outlets to manage. He called Evelyn Mama, and also, when he wanted something she was likely to deny, Evie, which he had heard Nathan use and deployed with calculating precision. She told Nathan about the calculating precision one evening, amused and slightly alarmed. "He's going to be a negotiator," Nathan said. "He's 3. He's already negotiating." She looked at the monitor on the counter, where the small room with the yellow walls showed James asleep with the specific abandoned quality of a child in deep sleep, arms flung, complete surrender to the unconscious. She looked at him for a moment. There was a thing she thought about sometimes, when she was in this particular state, slightly tired, happy in an ordinary way, standing in a kitchen that had become the center of a life she had not been able to imagine from the far side of the worst years. She thought about the woman she had been in the marriage to Damien, the careful, managed version of herself she had maintained in that house. The way she had spent energy she didn't notice spending on staying small, staying quiet, not being too much. She was not that woman. She had not been that woman for years, but she remembered her with something that was neither pity nor distance, more like the particular tenderness you feel toward a younger version of yourself who was doing the best she could with what she had. That woman had eventually stopped managing herself and started walking out. It had taken longer than it should have, and it had cost more than it should have, and she had been afraid in the specific way you are afraid when the familiar, even the painful familiar, is behind you and the unfamiliar is ahead. She had walked out anyway. And here was the kitchen. Here was Nathan, reading at the table. Here was the monitor showing James in the yellow room. Here was a company she was building something real inside. Here was a life that was imperfect and real and completely, unmanageably hers. There was no clean lesson in it. Life didn't produce clean lessons, despite the way stories sometimes tried to arrange one. There was just the fact of it, that certain decisions, even the terrifying ones, opened into things that the unmade version of them couldn't have held. She turned off the counter light and sat down next to Nathan. He looked up from his book. "Good?" "Good," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, and outside the window the city did what it did, indifferent and alive and moving in every direction at once. And the two of them sat in the kitchen of their imperfect life and were simply there. Damien Cross served 28 months. The 4 months reduction came from a combination of good behavior documentation and participation in the education program, the latter of which the facility coordinator had included in his file with a note that described Damien's contribution to the financial literacy workshop as substantive and consistent. He walked out of Morgantown on a Tuesday morning in October. Carl was there in the parking lot, leaning against a rental car with a paper cup of coffee in each hand, wearing a jacket that had seen better years. Damien stood in the parking lot and looked at his brother and at the valley and at the pale October sky for a moment before he moved. "You came," he said. Carl handed him a coffee. "Of course I came." They drove to a diner 20 minutes from the facility and sat in a booth and ordered food that arrived in the particular no-ceremony way of diners, on thick ceramic plates, and ate it. The coffee was not good. The eggs were fine. Nobody was watching them or noting who they were or performing any kind of evaluation. Damien ate the eggs and drank the coffee and said to Carl, "I don't know where I start." "Start small," Carl said. "That's what Teresa said to tell you." "Teresa said that?" "She's been saying it for months. She also said to tell you you're coming to Denver for Thanksgiving and that it's not optional." Damien looked at his coffee cup. He thought about a boardroom 42 floors above Park Avenue and a restaurant where everyone could see him, and a life designed entirely for observation. He thought about a table by a library window, and a woman handing him a novel without ceremony, and a man in a kitchen bunk who had said, "You realize how much work you were doing to not be alone with yourself." He thought about James Ashford in a yellow room, asleep with his arms flung wide, surrendered completely to the quiet. "Tell Teresa I'll be there," he said. Carl nodded. They sat in the diner for another hour, and the October morning moved around them, and Damien Cross, 55 years old, former billionaire, convicted felon, newly released, imperfect and alive and no longer performing anything in particular, sat across from his brother and let the morning be what it was. Which was enough. It turned out that was enough.